America is the land of the rugged individualist. Taxes are lower, government is smaller, and if you want something, you must pay for it. Not like in some other countries where government does more, either through providing things or subsidising them, and to pay for it, taxes are higher. But there is one exception: amateur radio. For hams, the US is a socialist paradise. Generous frequencies, lots of power, no annual licence fees. And if you want to sit an amateur exam, the costs are very low as well, $15 US or about $22 Australian. Australian ham exams are dearer. The system is more complex, and with a smaller population and number of candidates, there's fewer people that you can spread the costs over. Plus, there's no more cross-subsidy from the Wireless Institute of Australia, which until recently ran the system. When exam services resume and the new provider takes over, the costs will be as follows. Is that the end of the story? Not for some people, because for some years it has been possible to do American amateur exams here in Australia. Why would anyone want to do that? You might be going to the US and wish to transmit there or in another country that recognises American licences. Or you'd like to operate a US-based remote control station. For both those, you'll need a US amateur qualification. Fortunately, that's fairly easy in the more densely populated states in Australia, because we have American accredited VEs, or volunteer examiners. There's now a third reason. Some might consider it a loophole, but it's been promoted so heavily that you can't really ignore it. Australians are qualifying as amateurs through the US system. They do American exams, get an FCC issued American Callsign, and then apply through the reciprocal licensing arrangements to get an Australian Callsign, all without having sat a local Australian exam. All this sounds a bit strange. You could do a cheap American exam now, or wait for the Australian exams to resume. I'll let you consider the pros and cons. What's most important is you do something and get on air.
Victor Kilowatt 3, Yankee Echo 59 Whiskey, India.
But you were beautiful coffee, and the ice wash, you did a wonderful job, my friend.
Theory and basic amateur regulations are pretty much the same everywhere. For example, you can't use amateur radio for commercial advertising, business transactions, religious evangelism, or political promotions. Only bands, modes and power levels applicable to your category of licence can be used on the air. Call signs are announced at regular intervals. Your station and operating should not cause interference to spectrum users, whether they be within or outside the amateur bands. And you should stop transmitting, listen and be prepared to assist should a distress signal be heard. But there's more to know. Some international differences in power levels, bands, modes and licence privileges are quite major. Studying for the American exams won't prepare you for the conditions applying here. That's where this video comes in. I'll go through 10 big differences between US and Australian licence conditions. It's not complete, but you should still find it handy if you're an American wishing to transmit in Australia, for instance a tourist, or you're an Australian going through the US licensing system. What are these differences? First of all, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, is the US radio spectrum regulator. Secondly, Australian amateur conditions are documented in a document called the Licence Conditions Determination. You need to read and study those to know what privileges we have here in Australia. You can find them on the ACMA website, acma.gov.au. Thirdly, the FCC has an online database called the ULS, or Universal Licensing System. Here in Australia, the equivalent is the Register of Radio Communication Licences. You can transmit when your address appears in that database. But if you move house, there's an obligation to advise the ACMA of your new address. Fourthly, Australian amateurs are issued with call signs starting with VK. Then there's a number that represents the state or territory you're based in. After that, 2, 3 or 4 letters. Yep, 4 letters. American hams don't have 4-letter call signs, but here in Australia we do. They're for the foundation license category. Number 5, unlike in the US, if you upgrade your license or move interstate, then you get a new call sign. Both the US and Australia have 3 license categories, but they're called different things and confer different privileges. For instance, in the US, they have Technician, General and Extra, whereas here in Australia, we have Foundation, Standard and Advanced. Operating privileges are different. US technicians can run quite a lot of power, but they're restricted to Morse communication below 28 MHz. Whereas our Foundation are restricted only to 10 watts, but they can use SSB on other frequencies that the US technician licensees can't. And talking about power levels, here's difference number 7. US hams in all license categories have more generous power levels than Australians. To find out the Australian power level, you need to look at the License Condition Determination document for your category of license. Number 8. Generally, American amateurs have more frequencies than Australian hams. For instance, Americans have bands at 5 MHz and 220 MHz. We don't have those in Australia. Another thing is that some of our bands, for instance 1.8 and 3.5 MHz, are much narrower in Australia than they are in the US. On the other hand, the US technician and general categories have quite severe sub-band restrictions in some bands that Australian amateurs can operate throughout. Memorise the LCD document for your license category in Australia before you get on air. Number 9. Another thing about the US is that American amateurs have FCC mandated band plans on various bands that tell you that you mustn't transmit SSB on certain frequencies that are restricted to CW only. In Australia, we have those band plans, but their frequency limits are different. And they're gentlemen's agreements, meaning they're observed by convention only. Still, you'd have to be pretty silly to go against them. And number 10. To operate in Australia, you need to know the difference between Compliance Level 1 and Compliance Level 2. Level 1 is loosely if you're running low power, provided you can't touch the antenna. You don't need to go through a formal process if you're confident that your station is Category 1 only. Whereas if you're running a bit more power or better antennas, then you might need to think about Category 2 and do an assessment. Information on this is provided in software written by VK3YE. These are the 10 main differences between amateur operating conditions in the US and those in Australia. If you want to operate amateur radio in Australia, you need to know about them. I've given you an overview, but you should look at all the detail. You can find that on the various web links that I'll provide just below. The main ones to look at are the ACMA, and in particular the License Condition Determination document, the WIA website for band plans and information on EMR, and the VK3YE website for the program you can use to assess your station's EMR compliance. No matter whether you do the Australian or the American exams, the main thing is you do something, get on air or increase your privileges.